Shortly after the release of Final Fantasy IV, the first game in the series to be released both in Japan and North America within the same year, Square began working immediately on the next installment in the series. The development history of Final Fantasy V is actually quite significant, because there were a number of key personnel who stepped up into more significant roles for the project that continue to have strong influences on the series even today. These included Yoshinori Kitase, who would go on to direct numerous Final Fantasy games shortly thereafter, and Tetsuya Nomura, who would later become a lead character designer on numerous titles and eventually a director himself. Nomura had worked previously on Final Fantasy IV with the debugging team, but for Final Fantasy V he received his first opportunity to work in a creative role as a monster designer. Kitase worked alongside series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi as an event scripter and scenario writer. While Sakaguchi conceived the overall story, Kitase was responsible for adding more humor to lighten up what was originally a very serious storyline. Final Fantasy V, like its predecessors Final Fantasy II and III, was not originally released outside of Japan on the Super Nintendo. It was scheduled to be released in the US as Final Fantasy III, but those plans eventually fell through and the project was cancelled. Lead translator on the project, Ted Woolsey, later explained one of the reasons behind the cancellation, stating that Final Fantasy V was just not accessible enough to the average gamer. Now what that really means is that Nintendo of America thought the game was too difficult for North American kids, and they didn't want to risk spending a lot of time, money, and resources localizing a game for a country where it may not be very well received. This decision might also have been influenced by the fact that Final Fantasy IV was not an immediate hit in the States, and so all plans to bring Final Fantasy V to North America on the Super Nintendo were cancelled. There were two other attempts made to localize the game on other platforms, but these projects were all regrettably cancelled before much work could be done on them. Fans of the series were outraged at Square's inability to deliver the game in English, but it wasn't Square's fault, it was Nintendo of America's fault. So Final Fantasy V became one of the first games ever to receive a fan translation. And for a long time, playing this fan translation on an emulator was the only way we could experience it here. However, in 1999, Final Fantasy V was finally officially localized in North America as part of the Final Fantasy Anthology on the PlayStation. It's also been ported to the Game Boy Advance, as well as iOS and Android devices. The original PlayStation version can also now be downloaded on the PlayStation Store. But whichever version you decide to pick up, you're certain to be met with a wonderfully designed game that features a deep and captivating class-changing system, memorable and lively characters, and one of the best soundtracks in the series. The story doesn't have perfect balance, and I'm really not a fan of the villain at all, but the pros far outweigh the cons here, and the game is so mechanically sound that it's almost impossible not to like. While Final Fantasy V's battle system remains largely identical to its predecessor, the new job system is without question the best I've ever seen in an RPG. It takes everything that was good about the class changing of Final Fantasy III and improves upon that system in significant ways. One welcome change is that the player can now change jobs at will without having to acquire and spend class points. Each character begins as a freelancer, and in order to gain access to new jobs, the player must obtain crystal shards, very similarly to how new classes were obtained in Final Fantasy III. Once the player accesses the job system, characters begin to earn a separate form of experience points in battle, called ability points. So as you can see here, your characters level up by accumulating regular experience points, but your jobs level up separately here with ability points. As you level up your character's jobs, new abilities are gained, which can, in an exciting new form of customizability, be carried over to other jobs. What this means is that you can effectively create a thief with all of the agility and stealing that come to that class that also has the barehanded fighting ability and strength of a monk. Or perhaps you fancy a black mage who can learn enemy skills. Or maybe you'd like to try a white mage who can bend time and space. Or maybe you're more interested in a knight who can wield a weapon in each hand like a ninja. All of this is possible in Final Fantasy V, and I have to say that it's an absolute blast to experiment with all of the different job combinations and abilities that are available. It's also important to note that as you level up certain jobs to their maximum capacity, that your character's stats will also be increased and carried over into the freelancer and mime jobs. So for example, if you master the monk job, your strength will become maxed out, but if you switch over to a mage class, your strength will significantly decrease. If you switch back to a freelancer or a mime, however, your strength will remain maxed out. And this is also true of other stats like agility and magic power after mastering the thief and the black mage jobs. This means that the more jobs you master, the stronger your character will become as a freelancer or mime in the late game. Doing this essentially erases any semblance of difficulty the game has to offer, but it takes a lot of ability points to master these classes, so I'd say it's an ample reward for hours and hours of grinding. In terms of storyline and presentation, Final Fantasy V may polarize a lot of players. When I first played the game, I really didn't enjoy it at all because I was expecting something more along the lines of Final Fantasy IV and VI, an epic tale that makes an attempt to move the player emotionally. Final Fantasy V doesn't really try to do that in any form, but to discredit it because of that would be a mistake in my opinion, because when viewed with the proper open-mindedness and correct level of expectation, it's actually quite enjoyable. Once you start playing, it doesn't take long to see how unique the tone of Final Fantasy V is when compared to the other games in the series. While Final Fantasy IV took on a very dramatic storytelling style that emphasized heavier moral themes, Final Fantasy V adopted a much more lighthearted approach, mimicking the tone of a fairy tale rather than an opera, an influence which can be easily seen in both its predecessor and especially in its successor. Even the color palette in the game reflects this shift in tone, sporting what is easily the brightest and most saturated look in the entire series. When compared to the muted palettes of some of the other Final Fantasy games, it's kind of a wonder that 5 even belongs in the same franchise. It's this shift in tone, however, that makes Final Fantasy V stand out amongst a series of games that many consider to be a mess of convolution and melodrama. While I don't particularly agree with that sentiment, I must say that it is true that Final Fantasy V feels very refreshing. One thing I really appreciated about the graphics for Final Fantasy V was the addition of numerous expressive animations for the characters. In previous games, whenever a character was meant to express a certain emotion, the designers had to rely on dialogue to get it across. Every once in a while you might see a character lower his or her head, but aside from that, their faces were expressionless. In Final Fantasy V, however, the developers came up with a lot of creative ways to express emotions outside of the dialogue box, which greatly increased my connection to the characters and their personalities. Each character also has a unique costume for each of the 22 jobs in the game, which means there were a ton of sprites to draw. It's this kind of attention to detail that has always set Square apart in terms of the visuals for their games, starting with the very first game in the series, which sported, at the time, some of the most advanced battle animations ever seen in a video game. The plot is centered once again around 4 heroes trying to protect the crystals from a malevolent force seeking to destroy them, a device recycled from both the first and the third game. But this time around there are some really interesting additions. In this game, when the wind crystal is shattered, you actually get to see the effects and consequences of that event in the world. In the first game, the player is told in the prologue that the wind has stopped blowing, yet not too long after you get started, you find yourself exploring the world in a ship that is clearly utilizing a sail. In Final Fantasy V, when the game tells you that the wind stops blowing, it means it, which means you'll have to find other ways to power a ship. The story follows 4 central characters: Bartz, an adventurous young traveler; Lena, the princess of Tycoon; Galuf, an old man who has lost his memory; and Ferris, a pirate captain with a mysterious background. I think it's important to point out that Bart's name was originally translated as Butts, and let's be honest here, Butts is a way better name than Bart's, so I will heretofore refer to him as Butts. Anyway, the party meets up early on and decides to investigate the sudden halt of the wind by traveling to the Wind Shrine. There they discover the broken shards of the Wind Crystal and are chosen as the 4 Warriors of Light, tasked with protecting the other crystals before they are destroyed as well. The company sets off together, arriving just a little too late to each shrine, where they must bear the guilt of the crystal's destruction. As the last of the crystals is destroyed, a powerful mage named Exdeath is released from a seal that the crystals had formed over him, and he divulges his plan to destroy the world and return everything to the void. Butts and company must then seek out Exdeath and stop him before all is lost. The plot is quite simple, but there really are some effective moments throughout. One thing I really liked about this playthrough, which I didn't get a chance to experience during my first run, was seeing all of the optional cutscenes that give background to the characters. These scenes really add a pretty significant level of weight to the story to balance what is otherwise a rather lighthearted and silly affair. One of my biggest criticisms of this game originally was that it gave no proper background or motivation to its leading cast or villain, which, as it turns out, is completely untrue. You just have to seek out that information a little bit by exploring the world. This time around, I actually enjoyed the characters quite a lot, and would even go as far as to say that it may be one of the more memorable casts in the series. The one complaint I have with them is that they are a little too similar to each other. Each character is virtually a clone in terms of their convictions and morals. They're each about as perfectly selfless and eager as they can get, which makes them indistinguishable in a lot of ways. I think that's forgivable, however, since a lot of JRPGs tend to lean on characters that are quite unlikable and a lot of times pretty selfish. There are still a few moments that feel strikingly out of place, however. I'm sorry, but I really just can't forgive the scene where Exdeath disguises himself as a splinter in Kryle's palm. That might be one of the dumbest things I have ever seen in my life. But overall, the story doesn't get in the way of itself. And while it isn't very deep or moving, it's still a lot of fun if you take it in stride and try to remember that the developers weren't trying to create an epic on Final Fantasy VI's level. They just wanted to make a fun and upbeat game, and I feel like in the end they certainly accomplished that goal. Overall, Final Fantasy V is an excellently designed game, and one that feels quite unique and refreshing. Its change in tone might feel a little offbeat to some, but in a series that's filled with what many might consider an overdramatic form of storytelling, it's nice to have a little humor to break up the monotony. The gameplay mechanics are also some of the best I've ever seen in an RPG, with hours of very enjoyable experimentation, party customization, and exploration to be had. There's really not much more you can ask for in a game. And so my final score for Final Fantasy V is 4 butts out of 5.